Welcome to Last Minute Lecture. This free chapter overview is designed to help students review and understand key concepts. These summaries supplement, not replace, the original textbook and may not be redistributed or resold. For complete coverage, always consult the official text.
You know, usually when we talk about human anatomy, there's this underlying assumption that the body is just a perfectly engineered plumbing system.
Right, like it's all just fixed pipes and valves.
Exactly. You have pipes of a specific diameter, valves that open and close exactly when they're supposed to, and a central pump. And as we grow up, that system just sort of scales up.
Yeah, it's a very predictable, comforting way to look at things.
It really is. But that is completely upended today. Welcome to this deep dive. If you are a nursing student, think of this as your specialized one-on-one tutoring session designed specifically for you.
Because the reality of pediatrics is far less predictable.
Right. Our mission today is to master Chapter 15 of Davis Advantage for Maternal Child Nursing Care, the 3rd edition. We are looking at caring for the child with a respiratory condition. And we're going to break this down logically from normal anatomy to complicated conditions, so it all just clicks into place for your exams and clinical practice.
And the central clinical focus of this chapter, the thing you have to keep in your mind, is understanding how a child's unique, developing anatomy makes them incredibly vulnerable to respiratory distress.
Which is huge, because I read that respiratory issues account for, 25% of all pediatric consultations?
Yes, exactly 25%. It's massive. So as a nurse, you have to tailor your assessments and interventions to these physiological realities.
Okay, let's unpack this. To recognize what's going wrong in a pediatric patient, we first have to understand the baseline anatomy, right? Like how it develops and why it makes them get so sick so fast.
We always start with the division of the upper and lower respiratory tracts, and the newborn airway is terrifyingly narrow.
I mean, how narrow are we actually talking?
A newborn's trachea is only 4 millimeters in diameter.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, that is about the size of a drinking straw. And compare that to an adult's, which is 18 to 20 millimeters.
That is a huge difference.
It is. Plus, it bifurcates or splits much higher up. It splits at the 3rd thoracic vertebra, the T3, versus T6 in adults.
And the angles are different too, right? Because the right bronchus is shorter and more vertical.
Exactly. And that right there is why inhaled foreign bodies, like a bead or a piece of food, love to lodge in the right bronchus. Gravity just pulls it straight down.
So it's basically a slide straight into the right lung.
Yeah, unfortunately. And then you have to look at the chest wall. Children under 6 are abdominal breathers, and they have really weak intercostal muscles.
The muscles between the ribs.
Right. So when airway resistance increases, their diaphragm pulls down hard. This creates a negative pressure that literally sucks their weak chest wall inward.
Which explains the retractions, like when you see a baby breathing hard and their skin is pulling in around their ribs.
Exactly. You are physically seeing that negative pressure at work.
And on top of that, their lower airways are going through this crazy growth spurt. A full-term infant has 20 to 50 million alveoli, but by age 8, that explodes to 300 million.
It's incredible. It increases the surface area for gas exchange 9-fold.
It really is. But if a newborn's trachea is a 4 millimeter fast food straw, a tiny bit of mucosal edema is like squeezing that straw. The physics of airflow change drastically. Does this explain why newborns are obligatory nose breathers?
It does. They don't automatically open their mouths to breathe if their noses are stuffed up. And because newborns produce very little respiratory mucus at first, their non-productive coughs make them highly susceptible to infections.
It's because they can't cough the junk out.
Exactly. They don't have that sweeping mechanism yet.
Which brings us to a really important theme. Because the respiratory system is so physically demanding to maintain, chronic conditions can quickly derail a child's overall growth and development, right?
Absolutely. Think about conditions like cystic fibrosis or asthma.
Right, CF and asthma.
Managing those requires exhaustive energy. The sheer work of breathing can burn up all their calories, leading to delayed milestones and isolation.
So, as a nurse, our interventions for their development are crucial. We can't just give them an adult incentive spirometer.
No, you use therapeutic play. You have them blow bubbles or blow on pinwheels.
Oh, that's smart.
Yeah, it promotes deep breathing, lung expansion, and even fine motor skills, all while just feeling like play to the child.
I love that. And this naturally leads to how we assess and track their lung function over time. If you look at Table 15:1 for assessing respiratory rate, the numbers are wild.
They are. A preterm newborn's normal respiratory rate is 40 to 70.
40 to 70 breaths a minute.
Yes. And it decreases steadily down to 14 to 20 by adolescence. But here is the critical clinical framework you must count for a full minute.
No cutting corners and multiplying by 4.
Never, because their rates are so heavily affected by crying, anxiety, and fever.
So if a toddler is screaming and terrified during my assessment, how do I get an accurate respiratory rate?
You capitalize on the quiet moments before you even touch the child. You stand by the door, watch their chest, and count.
Sneak up on the data.
Exactly. And always explain the process to the child and parents, first using age-appropriate language to minimize that anxiety.
That makes total sense. And for older kids, we have diagnostic tools like pulmonary function testing or PFTs and spirometry.
Right, usually using a body plethysmograph, that clear box they sit in.
The textbook notes how a patient takes 3 long blaths of air, receives a bronchodilator like albuterol, and then repeats the test 15 minutes later to evaluate effectiveness.
Which is a great way to objectively measure if your interventions are working.
Exactly. Now that we know how to measure lung function, we need to look at what happens when cystic diseases or severe acute distress completely overwhelm these delicate diagnostic baselines.
And cystic fibrosis is the perfect example of this.
Right. So CF is an autosomal recessive disorder of the exocrine glands.
Meaning both parents have to pass down the mutated gene, and it creates this thick, tenacious mucus that blocks airways.
Like incredibly thick.
It's like glue. And that mucus creates a perfect habitat for bacterial growth in the lungs. But it also blocks pancreatic ducts, preventing food metabolism, and eventually occludes reproductive ducts.
So the nursing care and education for CF is intense. You're teaching families to maintain a high-calorie diet, taking pancreatic enzymes with meals, monitoring for salt depletion, and doing chest physiotherapy or CPT.
Yes, CPT is a daily, critical intervention.
Here's where it gets really interesting. If the mucus in CF is that thick, is CPT basically like pounding the bottom of a glass ketchup bottle to get things moving? And if so, why do we specifically teach families to do it before meals?
That ketchup bottle analogy is spot on. You are physically jarring the mucus loose. But doing that can induce vomiting of all that newly liquefied, thick mucus.
Right.
So doing it after eating would compromise their much-needed caloric intake. They just throw up all their food and those expensive enzymes.
Oh, wow. Yeah, definitely do it before they eat. And speaking of interventions, there's a safety box in the chapter about structural interventions, specifically chest tubes.
Yes, strict rules there. You never clamp the tube during transport.
Never clamp it.
Right. You check the dressing per policy and immediately report changes in oxygen saturation or excessive bleeding.
Because if things go south, a child can slip into respiratory distress, which is defined as the failure to match the body's metabolic demand for oxygen.
And the signs are very clear: tachypnea, head bobbing, grunting, and nasal flaring.
And if that progresses, it can turn into acute respiratory distress syndrome, or ARDS.
Yes, which requires ICU care, precise IV fluid and calorie monitoring, and ventilator support.
It escalates so quickly. So moving anatomically down the respiratory tract, let's start with the upper airway, where infections capitalize on those narrow developing structures we discussed earlier.
The sinuses are a great place to start.
Right, because sinus development is so staged. The maxillary and ethmoid sinuses are present at birth, but the sphenoid starts at 2 years, and frontal sinuses don't develop until age 7.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Which makes rhinosinusitis incredibly tricky to diagnose in young kids. You can't have a frontal sinus infection if you don't have frontal sinuses yet.
That is such a wild concept to wrap your head around, but the really critical comparison the textbook provides is the table on the Krupp's syndrome.
Yes, this side-by-side comparison is essential for clinical judgment.
Let's run through it. So, Krupp or laryngotracheobronchitis.
That one is viral. It has a gradual nighttime onset, that classic seal bark cough, wild fever, and an X-ray shows subglottic narrowing known as the steeple sign.
Like a church steeple.
Exactly.
Okay, then contrast that with epiglottitis.
Epiglottitis is bacterial, and it has a rapid onset. The child will have a toxic appearance, high fever, drooling, muffled speech, and they'll sit in a tripod position.
Leaning forward to keep the airway open.
And an X-ray shows the thumb sign.
And then there's bacterial tracheitis, which is a severe complication of a viral illness with thick, purulent secretions. In an emergency, before we even get that X-ray to look for a steeple or thumb sign, what is the absolute biggest red flag that tells me I'm looking at epiglottitis instead of regular croup?
It is the speed of onset, the presence of drooling, because they can't even swallow their own saliva in that tripod position. Those are your immediate clinical giveaways.
Good to know. And for interventions, the medical care for viral croup is cool mist to soothe mucosa and lessen anxiety, and nebulized racemic epinephrine.
Which is crucial because racemic epinephrine causes mucosal vasoconstriction and decreases the edema.
It shrinks the swelling.
Exactly. But you have to know the hospitalization safety parameters. You admit them if they have severe stridor at rest, cyanosis, depressed mental status, or hypoxia on room air.
Right. So when infections bypass that upper airway and move down into the bronchioles and alveoli, the problem shifts from simply getting air into exchanging gas effectively.
Which is the difference between bronchitis and bronchiolitis.
Because bronchitis is inflammation of the larger tubes, but bronchiolitis targets the small airways.
Yes, and RSV, respiratory syncytial virus, is the most common cause of bronchiolitis and pneumonia in kids under 1 year.
RSV is everywhere.
It is. It causes massive edema, thick mucus, and air trapping in the alveoli, which leads to respiratory acidosis.
Because they can't blow off the CO2. So RSV nursing care is intense. Contact precautions are mandatory. So gowns, gloves, masks. Interventions focus on supportive care, right? Head elevated 30 to 40 degrees, IV fluids for hydration to thin secretions, cool mist oxygen therapy, and palivizumab or Synagis prophylaxis for high-risk infants.
We also have to watch out for pneumonia and pertussis.
Right. Pneumonia can be lobar, interstitial, viral, bacterial, or aspiration. And pertussis, which is whooping cough, requires droplet precautions and constant monitoring of hydration and those paroxysmal coughing fits.
It's exhausting for the child.
So what does this all mean? The text says a viral pneumonia can lead to a secondary bacterial infection 6 to 8 days later. Is the virus basically acting like a bulldozer, tearing up the respiratory lining and leaving potholes where bacteria can easily settle and grow?
That's a great analogy. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the initial viral insult dismantles the lungs' protective mechanisms. The cilia are damaged, the mucosa is inflamed, and the bacteria just move right into those potholes.
Wow. Okay. Finally, we move from infectious lower airway issues to chronic, allergen-driven lower airway disorders that demand intense patient education and self-management.
Like allergic rhinitis.
Right.
This is an IgE-mediated response to dust or pollen, which releases histamine and leukotrienes.
But the big one is asthma. The text outlines the triad of asthma. First, you have bronchial smooth muscle spasm. Second, inflammation and edema of the mucosa. And third, thick, tenacious secretions.
All three working against the child at once, and you have to watch out for status asthmaticus.
Which is a medical emergency.
Yes, it's where a child stops responding to therapy altogether.
So monitoring and care are everything. We teach families to use a peak flow meter with the green, yellow, and red zones as part of an asthma action plan. Nursing care includes giving quick relief versus long-term meds on time, elevating the head 30 degrees, or side-lying or semi-prone, and pushing hydration.
Hydration is key.
Why is hydration such a priority nursing intervention during an asthma attack? Shouldn't we just be focused on opening the airway?
What's fascinating here is you have to remember the third part of the asthma triad, the thick secretions. Hydration liquefies those secretions, literally washing away the physical blockade inside the lungs so they can clear it.
That makes total sense. Fluid is the best expectorant.
Exactly.
Well, let's briefly recap this journey. We went from a 4-millimeter trachea and developing alveoli through the systemic challenges of CF, down past the steeple signs of croup, into the viral battleground of RSV, and finally mastered the asthma triad.
And as a final thought, think about the sheer math of a child's lung development. They go from 20 million alveoli at birth to 300 million by age 8.
It's mind-blowing.
In a very real way, for many of these pediatric respiratory conditions, time and physical growth are themselves the most powerful forms of treatment. Your job as a nurse is to fiercely protect that child's airway long enough to let their own anatomy grow into its full strength.
Wow. Protect the airway until they outgrow the danger. We hope this has made Chapter 15 crystal clear for you. Keep up the amazing work in your studies, and a warm thank you from the Last Minute Lecture team.